Auster on the loose. Does anyone remember Auster on the loose? Only a few of you. It's amazing. Well, there was a pilot, Anthony Thrower, who was, I've made these aeroplanes up. They're typical, but don't take into account the registration because I've doctored them. You'll note there's no one in that, and each time you see it in the future, there'll be no one in it. So he was on a private flight out of Bankstown early one morning, a Thursday morning, on the 30th of August 1955, returned to the airport on very late, finally pulled the throttle off and the engine stopped, the prop stopped. So he landed and rolled forward a bit and thought, well, being a bit of a smarty, I'll get out and I'll hand start it. So I got out and swung the prop. It had a fairly high throttle setting and the aeroplane took off without him. He grabbed at the strut, but he couldn't hold on, and the aircraft just disappeared. The next thing, he was amazed when it became airborne. So there's an aeroplane in the air with no one on board. It climbed gradually and just missed the control tower, did a complete circuit of the aerodrome and passed over the hangars for some of the establishments there. By this time people were becoming aware that there was something amiss. They were coming out to have a look at it. A gust of wind got the aeroplane and the wing dropped and it headed for the centre of the field. And that's exactly where the pilot was. The aeroplane was heading directly for him. He was thinking of throwing himself on the ground to avoid being struck by his own aeroplane. The aeroplane continued climbing after it passed over him, and it was heading towards Sydney, the town. And so there just happened to be a Commander Grove in another Auster who was transiting to Schofield's airfield out of Sydney, and he offered to say, I'll shadow the aeroplane and keep an eye on it for it and report where it is. So he came into the system. His aeroplane was red, but Thrower's aeroplane was blue, and so there was a clear distinction between the two aircraft. After a while it was decided that they should do something more about this than just shadow it, so they started to call in the RAAF. The RAAF at Williamtown decided they would launch a Wirraway. Oh, sorry, that's the shadow aircraft. So they launched a Wirraway with a man in the back with a Bren gun. He had a couple of magazines on board, and so off they went. And by this stage, the blue Auster, the ex-Thrower Auster, had climbed to 8,000 or 9,000 feet and was heading north up the coast, north of Sydney. And so by the time the Wirraway got to it, it was pretty cold outside. So the gentleman in the back picks up the Bren gun and fires a load of shot into it. The aeroplane continued on. What they hadn't realised was that the Bren gun was going to get hot as it was being fired, and he didn't have any gloves, let alone that the other magazines that he had with him were getting very cold. He couldn't reload the Bren gun, so they gave it away. So it continued to climb. It was heading up the coast. So they thought they'd go for the real Air Force. So they called in a Meteor. It happened to be a stand-down day for the Air Force, and a lot of the appropriate people weren't on the aerodrome, so they quickly armed it up and shot it into the air. When it got to the runaway Auster, the guns wouldn't work. Either they hadn't been loaded properly or something had gone wrong. So the pilot returned to Williamtown. They fired up another Meteor and it taxied out to the end of the runway, and by the time it got there, the people in high places had decided there was a better plan. So they asked him to return to the tarmac. Just happened that 2 Navy aircraft had just finished a firing exercise at one of the ranges, firing ranges, and they were in good form. They'd just completed their exercise. Everything they were shooting was working and hitting the target. So they reloaded, refueled these 2 aircraft, and they took off with the instructions to shoot down the Auster. So away they went. The first one got some 20mm cannon into it, it rolled over, burst into flames and started to descend. The second one decided he'd have a couple of shots as it was descending, so as it went from its 9 or 9,500 feet down to sea, he got a few shots in as well. But what I didn't mention was the news of this got out to the radio stations and was being advertised all over Sydney on the radio. The fire brigade had been warned that there was an aeroplane up there and could crash somewhere. The ambulance was warned and police were warned, and they were all at ready stations in case this aeroplane descended into Sydney. By the time it got up the coast to where it was shot down, there were thousands of people standing on hills and vantage points watching what was going on. So it took off on its own at 8:56 and ended up at Broken Bay, a broken aeroplane, at 11:45, nearly 3 hours in the air on its own. It took the Air Force and the Fleet Air Arm to shoot it down, and in fact, the 2 pilots in the 2 aircraft that shot it down were POMs on exchange. So Australia virtually had no success. So the Air Force admits defeat and questions were asked in Parliament. The runaway aircraft was laughable. I first heard this story from a bloke called Dick Jackson, and Dick tells one of the best stories you've ever heard. At the end of him telling one of these stories, you really have your sides split. So I haven't done it justice by comparison. But anyway, it's a good story and it's part of our history, like it or not.